My name is Mor Dioum. I'm the director and co-founder of the Victoria Climbié Foundation UK, an organization that came out of the Victoria Climbié public inquiry in the UK to campaign for effectiveness in child protection policy and practices, and to fulfill a gap that was identified during the course of the Victoria Climbié public inquiry, and that is to bring about closer link between those agencies funded by the public purse to safeguard children and the BME community. I must admit I'm delighted. I'm delighted to be attending this first Counter Child Trafficking online conference from my desk in London in the UK. And I applaud the actions of the conference organizer, the commitment, the diligence, and especially the level of professionalism that's been developed to ensure that this conference takes place. Counter Child Trafficking Bureau and Touchpoint have really been a highlight to what we can do using the internet to ensure that trafficked children are protected, to raise awareness around child trafficking and the devastating effect it's having on children. Child trafficking, the prevalence of child trafficking is global. It's happening from many corners of this world. And I, as members of society in this world, must put our efforts together to ensure that we eradicate this devastating practice on some of the most vulnerable people within our society, and they are the children. It is evidence that millions of children are being trafficked at the moment from all over the world. And it is important not to take a defensive attitude or a denial, if I may say that, around the enslavement of children around the world. It is a fact that 2 million girls aged 5 and 15 are initiated into commercial sex, for example. It's a wide industry. It's been exploited by people, in our view, who have no remorse and must be tackled and dealt with in the context of law within countries or in the context of even international law. It is not just girls that are being trafficked. Boys are also being trafficked for pedophile abuse, sexual abuse, tourism, child pornography, and so forth. And what is even more shocking in some of the corners of the world with this boy being trafficked is using them as slave labor, exploited the labor of these boys, often young adolescents. I'll come into that more in details during the course of this presentation. For example, in the UK over the last few years, we came across a number of young adolescent children who are being trafficked. In this case, especially from mainland China. And the purpose of that was to use them here in the cultivation of marijuana in houses around the UK. Although victims are disproportionately female, between the age of 12 and 16, again, I will reiterate the level or the number of boys, young adolescent children who are part of these criminal triads organized around the world. But the sad thing about it is that these traffickers know exactly who their targets are. Often victims are from ethnic minority, poor, destituted, lack of education and vocational skill, socially deprived, and as I said, from poor communities. That tend to be really the targets for perpetrators of this type of crime. It can be prevented, and we must develop methods of prevention to ensure that we stop this crime, we stop this type of crime, not just to stop it, but also identify perpetrators of this crime, and as I said earlier, dealt with them in the context of the law in various countries. But in order to eradicate this crime, in order to access victims of trafficked children, it is extremely important that we adopt a victim-based approach. Ensure that trafficked children access appropriate services. A few years back, we were delivering a service within the UK. And although those children were identified as non-accompanied children, some of those children clearly were being trafficked. And we had no doubt about it. But the reason why I say that is to clearly explain why we need a victim-based approach. Rather than focusing, for example, on a victim of child traffic around his immigration status, his age, which have been the experience sometimes in the UK, we must identify when we come in contact with these children, what are their needs? What can we do to further protect him? What can we do to ensure that they effectively engage with the relevant authorities to protect them? What can we do to ensure that they cooperate properly with the relevant authority? Rather than focusing on issues that may distance them, or that issues that may put them in a position to hide the trauma they're going through. The level of protection that these victims need are large and across the board. They need assistance, including proper identification and protection from further physical and physiological harm, including information around their rights and proper legal support. But above all, it's important from where we are sitting to ensure that these children access appropriate services to meet their needs. And in order to do that, at the foundation, what we've been doing is to ensure that the UN Conventions on the Rights of the Child, for example, is embedded within child protection work. To have effective protections, to deliver appropriate services to these children, it is important we use the UN Convention on the Right of the Child, especially in this type of cases. Article 19 will deliver us the tools we need and deliver the level of protections that we do owe to these children. But in order to provide effective support around this issue, it is important to understand the impact trafficked children go through, the impact it's having on victims of trafficked children. And from BCF's perspective, and I'd even recommend from an international perspective, child trafficking is child abuse, therefore had to be dealt with in the context of a child protection, or in the context of the child protection work, in the context of the child protection framework. Often victims of child trafficking are physically abused, emotionally abused, sexually exploited, and often very much neglected. They are deprived from the basic need of society, which is education. Their physical health have almost been destroyed, emotionally disturbed. The level of trauma they go through is actually, you cannot explain it as a child. Where a child needs protection, where the child needs nature, where the child needs guidance, these children are being humiliated in a degrading treatment that no one can explain. The level of violence they go through and the level of unrelenting fear and abuse they go through put them in a situation, as I said earlier on, where they're emotionally traumatized. Therefore, understanding the impact that child trafficking is having on its victim will enable us and allow us to develop appropriate services, to develop effective mechanisms and tools to ensure that these children are protected with no compromise at all. We cannot continue in the 21st century to compromise the safety protections of children. If we are to become a society with norms, a society with qualities, then we must gather our efforts to ensure that trafficked children are protected, to ensure that the perpetrators of these crimes are detected and dealt with in the context of the law. The UN Convention provides us an essential tool to not just prevent child trafficking, but to also ensure that where victims of child trafficking are detected, to meet their needs. If we are to learn more about trafficking of children, if you are to understand the global phenomenon on children being trafficked, where we've come across with victims of children being trafficked, let's stay away from trying to identify their immigration status, but rather focus on identifying the need of these children and how we are going to meet it. It is possible for us to eradicate this degrading crime, but I believe unless we have a global approach, such as the system that's being developed today where I'm giving my presentations, I'm afraid we'll have a challenge and we'll miss out on some opportunity to prevent further children from being put in a place as a victim of child trafficking, or to prevent further children from being trafficked around the globe. So I call upon those involved, I call upon activists to use this tool, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, especially Article 19, where they're confronted with the victim of a child or victim of trafficking, to ensure that the necessary needs of those children, of those victims' children, are met. But in order to identify the need of this child, in order to provide prevention tools, in order to effectively protect this child, every victims of child trafficking must be dealt with under the International Child Protection Framework. Here in UK, we do have a very, very sound child protection framework. But often what we do not understand is the level of impact and destructions, if I may say so, that these children have had to go through. They are often physically abused, sexually traumatized, sexually exploited, emotionally traumatized, and often very, very neglected by society. Child trafficking victims do not have the opportunity to access education like their peer group. They come from often at the place of departure where education was not accessible. By the time they arrive to their point of arrival, their physical health have been affected because they've left loved one behind, or they've lost loved one. The level of destruction during the course of their abuse in terms of their physical health is unmeasurable. As I said, emotionally disturbed, that level of physical and emotional trauma, as society, we must ensure that they don't have to go through that at all. In my view, it's a crime for everyone to witness that kind of victim, or to be in contact of kind of victim, and allow the continuity of physical and emotional trauma. Often during the course of these exploitations, the level of humiliation they're going through, because they're largely isolated, the degrading treatment that is being used, the fact that they're no longer even considered as children, but not as human beings, and used and abused and exploited as commodity, is something each of us has a responsibility, and we ought to stop. We must not witness children going through this violence. The unrelenting fear and abuse during the course of these crimes they have to go through must be declared as a crime in a world stage. The prioritization of children's safety and protection must be at the core of every activist, at the core of every professional, and at the core of every government. It can be prevented, but in order to have prevention, as I've been talking about, we must have a victim-based approach. Ensure that trafficked children access appropriate services, focusing on identifying their needs. Stay away from immigration issues, age issues, and so forth. Only then we can appropriately identify and protect children, trafficked children, from further physical and physiological harm, including information on human rights and legal support. By that I mean where trafficked children are identified, the priority is to ensure that we meet their rights in terms of support, in terms of accommodation, in terms of schooling, and above all, in terms of safety and their protection. We cannot continue in the 21st century to ignore the exploitation of children. We cannot continue in the 21st century not to protect some of the most vulnerable people within our society, and they are children. There is no excuse. The tools are there, as I said. Article 19 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child provides us the right to protect and give appropriate services, identify their need and meet their needs in the context of the rights of the child. Here in Britain, as I talked about earlier on, the child protection framework, we do have a very sound child protection framework, and all children can be dealt with and effectively protected under Section 47 of the 1989 Children's Act in the UK. Therefore, I reiterate, the tools are there. Let's use it to ensure that the children access effective services and are well protected. As I said in my introduction, it is a global phenomenon. Children are being trafficked across the corners of the world. That is being identified, and we must ensure that we take care of the situation. When I talked about taking care of the situation, I'm looking of nothing less than the protection, the full protection of these children. The reason why I talked about full protection of these children is about 4 years ago, I traveled to Sub-Saharan Africa, to the Ivory Coast. There, the Victoria Climbié Foundation had built a school. And the purpose of building that school was to ensure that excuses in terms of education are not used to traffic children, for example. To ensure that no other child goes through the experience Victoria Climbié had to go through. But during the course of building that school, I take the opportunity to visit the inland. And there I came across coffee plantations, and I came across cocoa plantations. And what is so shocking to me is the number of children working on these cocoa and coffee plantations under the conditions of forced labor, often forced to work in those plantations. They were being used as slave labor. I went even further and tried to understand, how did these children get into those places where they're not loved, they're not shown kindness, they're exploited, abused, used, and rejected. But the shocking thing is, most of them did not know how they arrived in those places. When you ask them, often they're told that a stranger brought them over. Then you understand, if you come from the background of dealing with abused children, you realize how much the traffic of children is easy in some places and how much it is prevalent within those areas. I think what we must begin to do, use this opportunity to also identify the different dynamics. The story I've just described, children were not sexually abused, but were forced to work in those plantations, which is forced labor, often with no pay at all. And there is the exploitations and the level of slave labor that's being put upon these children. Again, if you come into Europe, the dynamic is slightly different in the context of European child trafficking. If you go to places like Italy, France, and to a certain extent in Belgium, a number of young women were being trafficked in Europe for what? For sexual exploitation. They work either as prostitutions or as drug pushers. The boys are used now for the pleasure of pedophilia. So it is important for us who wants to eradicate this horrible crime to understand the dynamics at every corner of this level. As I talked about children being trafficked in the UK over the last few years, from mainland China to work on drugs or marijuana, a farm in houses. In Europe, you've seen them used as prostitutions and drug pushers and pedophilia. Also, what we've had in the UK over the last few years is a growing phenomenon of children being trafficked here for domestic servitude. And it's about time we act and try to do something about it. Now, in order to act effectively to prevent this horrible crime from taking place, and to ensure that these victims are not so frightened that they will not cooperate with the relevant agency or individuals like ourselves who are there to help them. We need to understand how they are being controlled, how they are being used, and so forth. Now, in addition to coercive physical and physiological method, using violence, threats, physical abuse, emotional and sexual abuse to control these children, there is a new growing phenomenon here where we are. Children who are being controlled under a belief system. And in this context, spirit possession and witchcraft linked to child abuse. Often, if I take the example of Africa, before they leave their point of departure, they are made to give an oath. And sadly, the purpose of giving that oath is to ensure that when they arrive upon the point of arrival, the perpetrators of this horrible crime have control over these children. The reason why they have control over these children under a belief system is this. Because they've given that oath at the point of departure, these children actually believe that the perpetrators of this crime have control over their movement and their life where they are. And it makes it very, very difficult for professionals or for people like us to sometimes provide the necessary support, because the level of fear that is ingrained within them put them in a position to find it difficult to trust any individual around them, at the exceptions of the perpetrators. Therefore, working or engaging effectively with the professionals becomes quite difficult. And that is a new phenomenon that needs, alongside the violence, alongside the physiological method, alongside the threat, that needs to be taken into consideration quite strongly if we are to develop effective tools that will protect victims of child trafficking. There are a number of definitions across the world that are harmful cultural or religious, to a certain extent, practices used in different corners of the world. Voodoo is one. Often if you go to South America or children trafficked from that region, the word voodoo is used. If you hear juju, it's often coming from West Africa, and in this context, particularly Nigeria. Kindoki is used from Central Africa, for example, the Congo. It's a strong belief that people have or people use to control children. Ndoki is also coming from Central Africa. Jeans or jinne is often used from Sub-Saharan Africa in places like Senegal, Guinea, Sierra Leone, the Gambia, and so forth. The word obia, if you go to the Caribbean, for example, in places like Jamaica, Grenada, Trinidad, and St. Lucia, obia is often used to ensure that such victims are controlled. It is a tragic and sad circumstances we are in the plight of children. And what I'm saying to this platform is this. In order to counter child trafficking, we need a concerted effort. We are all convinced, and there is evidence out there, that no doubt it's reached an international phenomenon. It's a social and international problem and needs a global dimension to tackle it, dealt with it. And unless we have that level of collaboration, unless we looked at child trafficking in the first century from an international perspective, then the challenge will get greater. If we want to highlight the issues at that international level, it has to be a global effort. We have to stay from a unilateral approach around dealing with child trafficking. It needs a global approach. It has reached a global dimensions. And unilateralism is not going to eradicate or is not going to assist us from dealing with child trafficking. Unilateral approach will not assist us to identify perpetrators of crime and dealt with them in the context of the law. In conclusion, I would leave this meeting or the conference with this. In order to achieve absolute rights in every case of a trafficked child, the following key practices must be adhered to. Adopt a victim-based approach when dealing with child trafficking. Ensure that the needs of trafficked children are identified and met within international child protection work. Provide an appropriate support and services for victims of child trafficking. Ensure that trafficked children receive appropriate services in accordance with their rights. We must have provision of advice of child trafficking about their rights to be protected, their right to be safe, their right to achieve good health, to achieve education and economic well-being. We must continue to collaborate, work together between various agencies, NGOs, and countries with the view to eradicate this degrading practice on children. It must be stopped. Ultimately, he or she who cares wins. Thank you.